Whether you grew up vacationing in Maine and are looking to buy a place up here, or you're just doing some research to figure out if this is the next place you want to call home, there are a few misconceptions about living in Maine that I need to warn you about before you make the move. Living in southern Maine is likely nothing like you thought or heard it was. Whether you're vacationing here or you've looked at YouTube videos or TikTok, people are definitely romanticizing what life looks like up here. People often post pictures and videos of them going on boat rides, eating lots of seafood, shopping in quaint downtown areas, and living that small beach town lifestyle. And vacationing here is definitely like that. However, if you live here full time, you would know that it's cold for 75% of the year. Not a lot of people live here year round, and the job market can be scarce. And while I'm a strong believer in romanticizing your everyday life, I'm also a realist, and I'm gonna break down what life is like living in southern Maine. So let's get into it. By the way, my name's Margaret. My dad, Michael, and I are born and raised Mainers and local real estate agents, and we make videos to educate you about living in the southern Maine area. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. All of our information's down below, as well as some free downloadable resources for you to use as well. The first thing I wanted to talk about, and the first misconception, is that the coastal aesthetic of what people are posting on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube is what life is really like here in Maine. And while to a certain extent that might be true, that is definitely not what life looks like every day. In fact, a lot of people kind of steer away from going to a lot of those touristy seafood restaurants or going on those boat rides that you oftentimes see people going on, just because there's a lot of traffic to A, get to the places where those are, and B, they're just very touristy things to do. They're definitely fun to do a couple times a year, or do them here and there, or at least hit them once, depending on your interest level. But generally speaking, a lot of times people who actually live in Maine aren't really going to do those things that you kind of see in those coastal aesthetic videos of, you know, whether it's Maine or even Cape Cod. A lot of people compare the two of them. People who live here year round, 9 to 5 in the summer, are going to their jobs. They're not waking up and walking through the old port and going to local coffee shops and going on boat rides and, you know, ending their day on a walk along the beach. While we would love for our lives to look like that every day, unfortunately, that's really more what it looks like when you're vacationing here and not what your day-to-day looks like when you live here year-round. The second thing I wanted to talk about was the fact that there are no jobs here, according to a lot of people. And while the job market is definitely, you know, a lot more minimal than it would be, say, an hour and a half south of here in Boston, there definitely are jobs here, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Depending on what industry you work in, it might be kind of hard for you to find exactly what you're looking for if you're living in southern Maine. There are a lot of areas of southern Maine that are pretty suburban, and, you know, if you live up near Portland, a more urban area. But generally speaking, the vast majority of Maine is pretty rural, and depending on the industry that you work in, you might have to drive, you know, relatively far, you know, maybe even into Boston to find work in the career field that you work in. That's not to say that you can't find work up here. You certainly can. The job market is just smaller and a little bit more competitive, as all of the people are obviously trying to not commute into Boston every day for work or have to drive upwards of an hour. The next thing I want to talk about is the fact that Maine is always cold. Well, not always, but generally speaking, the vast majority of the year, it's fairly cold here. Now, if you're from Florida, obviously it's going to seem pretty cold here year round. But if you're from the Northeast, you would know that our winters last really from basically the end of October, November, all the way through April. It really doesn't start getting warm here until June, and then the warmth kind of dies off in the middle of September. So for the vast majority of the year, it is actually pretty cold. Our highest temperatures, you know, I've seen it get up to 100 degrees. It certainly doesn't happen very often. It sits around 85 degrees, at least in Wells, Maine, in that southern York County, Maine area. It can hit around 80, 85 degrees a lot of the days in the summertime, peak season, but generally speaking, it's really only warm for a couple months out of the year. And while that probably sounds pretty miserable to a lot of people, if you're from New England or you're from somewhere that's a little bit colder in general, you would know that getting yourself involved in winter sports or, you know, different winter activities definitely helps people get kind of acclimated to the area. If you talk to a handful of different people who are from Maine, who are from New England, a lot of the people who make it a point to find a winter activity that they really like, such as skiing, snowboarding, ice skating, hockey, any of those things, people who get involved and kind of find a way to enjoy the winter weather tend to have a more enjoyable time living here. Before we get into our next point, I just wanted to mention that we have some free downloadable resources down below for you to use as well, such as our updated relocation guide. Feel free to check it out. And number 4, there is a huge misconception that nobody lives here year-round. And while we definitely have a higher population in the summer due to tourism, there are definitely people who actually live here year-round. Though the state of Maine only has a population of maybe 1.5 million people, it's not a super populated state. The vast majority of those people live in the bottom 2 counties of the state. So it's obviously a lot more suburban in southern Maine than it is up in northern Maine. But it is important to point out that we do get a lot more people here in the summertime, and because of that, we get a lot more traffic. We get shops that are only open in the summertime. They're not open year round. It definitely is a completely different state in the winter than it is in the summer. So if you're planning on moving to the area, it's wise to check it out in both seasons so you really get a feel for what it looks like. I also wanted to mention that due to the presence of not a lot of people here, we don't really have things like Uber and DoorDash in most places in the state. A lot of times when people come to the area, you know, for example, for my wedding, back in October, a lot of my friends came to Maine and they were like, can we just Uber home from the wedding? The answer is no. You might have those things in the summertime. You definitely have them up in like Portland, for example, but generally speaking, in most areas of the state, especially in the fall, winter, springtime, we don't have those luxuries. There might be 1 or 2 people that do it, but generally speaking, it's not a reliable thing that you can count on, like you could if you lived in somewhere like Boston or really a lot of other different places in the country. Because there's a lot less people, there's not as big of a demand for this. So unfortunately, you can't rely on a lot of those things if you might be used to them living somewhere else. Kind of going off of that last point, I wanted to talk about the fact that most of the state is pretty rural. Generally speaking, along the coast tends to be a bit more populated. In like the Portland, Maine metropolitan area, it's obviously a lot more populated. In the bigger cities in the state, such as Bangor, Augusta, again, Portland, it's obviously more populated, but our biggest city by population, at least, Portland, Maine, only has about maybe 65,000 people in it. It's really not that big in comparison to a lot of other big cities around the US. And like I mentioned before, the majority of our state's population lives in the bottom 2 counties of the state, more specifically along the coast. So just keep in mind that a lot of areas in Maine are pretty rural. So if you're looking for the more suburban feel in Maine, you just have to do a little bit of research to kind of figure out what towns are right for you. But if you're looking for something rural, definitely northern Maine or more inland in Maine would be a better fit for you. And the final thing I wanted to talk about is the fact that there's not as much to do in Maine as there are maybe in other neighboring states. And what I mean by this is when people come and they vacation in the area, like I mentioned earlier, they can go on boat rides, they can go on tours, they can go to all of these different local shops and restaurants, and those things just aren't open year round, and they're oftentimes really touristy. There's a lot of traffic getting to those areas, and when they shut down in the fall anyways, there's just not as much to do. Like I mentioned, Maine is a fairly rural area, and if you live somewhere closer to, say, Portland, or you live where there's a highway exit, it could be fairly easy to get to somewhere where there's more activities to do. But say you live somewhere like Sanford, well, it's gonna take you 15-20 minutes just to get to the highway in Wells, and then it's another 30 minutes from the highway up to Portland. You're looking at 45 minutes just to get to the city in Maine. It's about 35 to 40 minutes to get to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is another smaller city, but there's still quite a bit to do over across the border into New Hampshire. But I do hear this as a fairly common complaint for people who are moving to the area. They feel like there's nothing to do. And so kind of going off of winter activities earlier, it's important to find activities really year round that you're interested in, that kind of keep you involved in the community, even more so in the winter, as for a lot of people, seasonal depression kicks in. But definitely finding activities to do, even though there is fewer of them, finding a few things, finding some hobbies are absolutely critical when you're moving to the area. So if you grew up vacationing, coming to Maine, or you've been watching a lot of videos on the internet, you definitely might have this perception that, you know, Maine is this beautiful coastal, beachy area, kind of a lot like Cape Cod, maybe fewer people in the area. And it definitely is like that a lot in the summertime, but unfortunately for the vast majority of the year, living in Maine is not like that, and it's a harsh reality that a lot of people face when they're thinking about moving to the area and they're checking it out for the first time. If you have any questions beyond this, feel free to reach out. And again, my name's Margaret. We'll see you next time.